Hi guys, I'm here to talk to you about the writing process. This covers chapters 1 through 9 in your textbook, but it seems a little silly to spend that much time. So I'm just going to narrate this a little bit to give you some additional information. Here are the steps that we're going to cover for the writing process, and you can see them here. Each one of these steps represents a chapter in your textbook, so if you have more questions, feel free to go look back at each of those particular chapters. So for example, pre-writing actually starts chapter 2 and then follows from there. So feel free to look back at those. So when we're talking about pre-writing, first you have to decide, what is my purpose, who is my audience, what will my tone be, and what point of view will I take? So for purpose, you have to remember that there are 3 purposes for writing. The first is to inform, or to entertain, or to persuade is the third. So you have to decide which of those purposes you will meet with the writing that you're going to be doing. The second is the audience, and that is, to whom am I writing? So I have to decide if I'm writing formally, informally, or who will be reading this particular paper. The tone that you take is the sound of your paper. The tone could be something sarcastic, it could be joyful, it could be somber. Of course, a lot of that depends on the purpose of your paper as well as the audience. And finally, point of view. That is, what point of view are you going to tell this story from, or are you going to write this from? Typically, if you're doing narrative, you write from first person, you use I. For some of the other papers, you will use third person, that is he or she. And all of this comes together to help you choose a topic. Remember that you also need to narrow your topic down depending on the length and the requirements of the assignment that you are given. So the first thing that you need to do once you decide those things is, of course, you have to gather information to decide on a topic. So you can do that a number of ways. You can do that through free writing, asking questions, just observing the world around you, reflecting on your experiences. All of these are great ways to generate ideas for a topic. If you have multiple ideas and you're not sure which one to choose, you can always use a web, an outline, or make a list to then explore the different ideas you have and decide which one would be the best choice. Just a few things to keep in mind about pre-writing. The longer the paper, the more time you should spend pre-writing, and there's a reason for that. It is so much easier to change a paper in the pre-writing stage than it is in the drafting stage. By the time you've got to the point of drafting, you should have all of your ideas laid out. And if you're in page 2 or page 3 of your paper and you decide this paper is just not working, that's a lot more work to start over than it is when you're in the outlining stage. So just something to think about. If you're writing a very long paper, you really need to spend some time pre-writing. Okay, so just a word of wisdom there. Okay, so once you've decided on a topic, then you have to decide what you're going to say about that topic. And so that's where your thesis comes in. The point of the thesis really is to give your point of view or your attitude about your subject. So if I'm going to write about my dog, what is it I'm going to say about my dog? Well, that, of course, is determined by my purpose and my audience and the tone that I'm going to take. But what is it that I'm going to prove, or what is the point that I'm going to make in this paper? That's what gets me to a thesis. Remember that your thesis should go at the end of your introduction. I know a long time ago when you were a little kid, they probably taught you to put it at the beginning, but that is not where an introduction or where a thesis statement goes in the introduction. So keep that in mind as well. And you always should have some kind of so what. Why does this matter to your reader? Okay, so once you've decided on a thesis, then you have to decide, okay, where am I going with this thesis? And by the way, let me say this, you don't always have to have a thesis before you start writing. Sometimes I don't have a thesis until I've started my paper, because sometimes I don't know where I'm going until I get there. So what this slide shows you are the different patterns or rhetorical modes that we will cover in this class. So you can see that we will cover each of these types of writing in English 101. So I will assign you the pattern of development or the rhetorical mode, which will then influence the thesis statement that you choose. Now, it is at this point that I like to issue a challenge, and here's the challenge. my challenge to you is that you choose one topic to write all of your papers on for the semester. So that would be starting with narrative. We'll do something different for description. But that would be starting with narrative, going all the way through and including the research paper. So you decide if you would like to do that. I've had lots of students complete this particular challenge. In return, I will give you 25 bonus points if you do complete the challenge, which is a free rough draft grade, okay, for having completed it. So take a look at the list. That would include narrative, illustration, division, classification, process, analysis, compare, contrast, cause, effect, definition, and the research paper, the argumentation, persuasion. So pick a topic, something you're really passionate about, because you're going to write a lot of papers on this topic if you're interested, and give it a try. If you decide later on in the semester that's just not working, that's okay, and you're free to drop it. I also reserve the right to tell you that you need to drop it if it's just not working. So the challenge, again, will cover this section through here, okay, all of those in there. So if you think that's something you'd be interested in, you will need to send me an email and let me know what you think your challenge topic would be. Now keep in mind, this cannot be too broad, so you can't just do music. You would need to choose a particular musical group. Or it can't just be sports. It'd have to be a particular team or something of that nature. It can't just be dogs. It would have to be a particular type of dog. So it can't be super broad. Obviously, that would be really easy. So keep that in mind when you're choosing. But send me an email if you think you would be interested in doing the challenge for the semester. It is a lot of fun. The reason that I like to do it is I think it really shows you the different types of writing when your topic doesn't change. And I find for my students who stress about writing, it's really easy to already have a topic decided. So keep those things in mind when you're thinking about whether or not to do the challenge. Okay, so once you have a thesis, so you have a topic and you know what you're going to say about that topic and you know what type of writing you have to do, the next part, of course, is to gather your evidence. Now, I will tell you, I've always called this specific details. I've never called this evidence. The book, though, uses the word evidence, so that's what I've used here. But there are a couple rules about details. They need to be specific, they need to be dramatic, they need to be accurate, and if you borrow them, you need to document where you borrowed the information from. That is, give a citation. Okay. The big ones are that they must be specific and they need to be dramatic. So don't tell me a lot. That's not specific. I need to know how many. And your evidence should be dramatic. So don't tell me that 40% of something, because that means 60% don't. All right, so make sure that your specific details meet those different criteria. As you're working, a lot of times what happens is that your thesis statement starts to evolve. So here are some things I want you to consider about your thesis statement. So these are things that you don't want to do to your thesis statement. So that is, make highly opinionated statements. That's something like, anybody who believes this is stupid. Obviously, that's not a good way to create goodwill. Don't make any announcements. I don't want a this essay will discuss. The essay should never talk about itself. We assume the essay is going to discuss something, since that's the point of an essay. All right, don't make just plain factual statements. Businesses pollute the environment. Well, that doesn't tell us what you're going to prove. Okay, so be very careful about that one. And then be careful that they're not too broad. Typically, that tends to be the problem with thesis statements. Not that they're too narrow, but that they are just too broad. So, high school education is often meaningless. Well, we could say that is true 100 different ways. But high school diplomas have been devalued by grade inflation is a much more specific and clear thesis statement. And again, remember that a thesis is what you plan to prove or to explain in your paper. So it is the overall idea of your paper. All right, then it's time to draft. That is, it is time to write the rough draft. And there's something that I want you to keep in mind about drafting. And I feel like many of my students struggle with this part. And sometimes it's because you're doing things that work against the type of writer you are. So let's talk about the different types of writers. The first one is the sprinter. The sprinter just writes. This is the person who sits down to a computer and just busts out the paper very quickly. Very little editing. It just all comes out. Now, how many of you out there are sprinters? Probably quite a few. The one thing you need to know, sprinters, is that you are terrible at editing your papers. And you really do need to spend some time editing your papers, because the problem with getting your words out so quickly is that you're not bothering to take the time to make sure they sound like they should or like you want them to. So you really do need to go back and edit. But one thing I've discovered is that sprinters are pretty terrible at editing. Some of you are shaking your head yes at that. If so, that's you, and you need to find someone to help you edit. That also means you're probably a procrastinator, and most of you are sprinters are probably shaking your head to that as well. If you're a procrastinator, you need to back your timeline up just a little bit, because you do need help editing. So keep that in mind. On the completely opposite end of the spectrum is the bleeder. I have seen bleeders at work, and it's painful to watch them. They're called bleeders because every word costs drops of blood. Every word takes time. They edit very frequently. Sometimes they'll write whole paragraphs and delete the whole paragraph and start over again. If there's a misspelling, sometimes they won't just fix the spelling. They delete the entire word or even the entire sentence. Bleeders, you need time. Don't put so much stress on yourself. You cannot be a procrastinator in this class because you have many papers to write, and since it takes you so much time to get the words out, you do not want to procrastinate. That will only stress you out more. And also, bleeders are great editors. So stop being so hard on yourself, bleeders. You're probably doing just fine. By the way, bleeders, don't find a sprinter to help you edit your papers. They're not going to do a great job for you. Sprinters, you might want a bleeder to help you edit your papers, but just know they're going to bleed all over your paper as well. So, know what type of writer you are. Now, those two are the very extreme ends of the spectrum, and of course there's the group in the middle, and these are the plotters. They tend to move forward, not too quickly, not too slowly. They understand that there's this tension that has to happen between creating words and putting words on paper, and also managing those words, that is, editing them as you go along. So if you're a lot of times we tend to be a combination. So we're either a plotter sprinter or a plotter bleeder. And all of those are fine, but make them work for you, not against you. So keep that in mind as you're working through this class. Know which type of writer you are and plan accordingly, because you have so many papers you need to write for this class. All right, so then once you're ready to draft, I don't know how many of you struggle with what I call blank page syndrome. If that's you, I have some suggestions for you. First of all, put your thesis at the top of the page. Now, some of you who really stress about writing think, I don't even have a thesis. I don't even know what I want my thesis to be yet. That's okay. How about you start with a title or your name? The biggest obstacle for students to get started is to just get something on the page. So think about that while you're working. If you're struggling to get started, just get something down, even if it's just your name, and that's perfectly fine. If you're struggling with the introduction and conclusion, start with the body paragraphs. If you've spent some time pre-writing, you probably already have an idea of what you want to put in the body paragraphs. So start with those, and then come back to the introduction and conclusion. That's perfectly fine. Keep in mind that each paragraph needs to have, or each body paragraph needs to have a topic sentence. That is, what is this paragraph about? So that's probably one of the key things I mark in the first few papers, is that you are missing topic sentences. Every body paragraph needs to have a main idea of covering what the paragraph is about. Also, be sure you include transitions. And the transitions that you should use should not sound like this. First, comma, next, comma. Okay, you want to use whole sentence transitions that show how this paragraph relates to the paragraph that you just completed. Also, when you're writing these body paragraphs, make sure you give very specific support that shows instead of tells. What that means is that you show us what you're trying to say instead of telling us. So don't tell us it was a beautiful day. show us it was a beautiful day, because my beautiful day may look different than your beautiful day. So if it's 72 degrees and there's no breeze and the birds are chirping and the grass is green and school's out and that's a beautiful day to you, then show us that instead of telling us that it was a beautiful day. This will greatly improve the content of your papers. Also use words that appeal to the senses. We call these sensory details. So what do you hear? What do you see? Things like that. So always appeal to the senses when you can. And finally, be sure you replace average words with more specific words. This is something I write a lot on papers, is be more specific. So don't tell me a lot. Don't tell me he was huge. I am 5'4". Most people are huge in my world. So if you tell me he was 6'4", and I understand that he's a foot taller than me, then I see that he's very tall. That also comes back to that show instead of tell. So there's some things to keep in mind when you're writing body paragraphs. So what can you include in the introduction? Well, here are some ideas, and by the way, the book covers this in the drafting chapter, but you can take from a broad statement to a narrow statement. So if I was going to talk about unsweet tea, this is one of my favorite topics. I love unsweet tea, and I have yet to have a student write papers on unsweet tea, so I feel pretty safe using this topic. But you can go from a very broad statement about just what people drink in general to a very narrow statement, and that is that unsweet tea is the best choice for a healthy drink, especially compared to beverages like soda. You can give an anecdote that is a personal story. You can start with an idea opposite of what you plan to speak on. So for my example, maybe I start talking about soda and that millions of Americans drink soda every day, but actually we need to start talking more about tea and replacing that with tea so that we can all be a little healthier. You can start with a series of short questions. I'll tell you I don't like this option, but the book does cover that one. You can start with a quotation. Typically you want to use someone famous in the space that you're talking about. You don't want to just use some regular old Joe Schmo off the street. Any sort of brief background information we may need to know that would help us understand your topic, especially if you're talking about something very technical or very specific. I had a student one semester do his challenge paper on nuclear energy, and so he had to, of course, give us some brief background information in each of his papers. You can refute a common belief. So using my example, most people believe that soda probably is one of the most popular drinks in America, but that's actually not true, especially worldwide. The most popular drink is tea, if we're talking about drinks outside of water. Or some sort of dramatic fact or statistic. But please make sure that it's dramatic, and if you borrow it, make sure you cite it. Okay, so then you have the conclusion. So here's some ideas for what to put in the conclusion. You can give us a summary. What is it that you have covered thus far? You can give us some kind of prediction. What do you think will happen in the future? You can come back to a quotation, or you can finish a quotation. You can give us some kind of interesting statistic, some kind of call for action. That is, what do you want us to do now that we have heard this information? Or you can leave, and also you should always do this last one, leave the reader with your so what. Why does this matter? Why do we care? Okay. Finally, be sure that you give it a title if you didn't do that before. Every paper should have a title, so make sure that you're doing that. Okay. So here's a step that I suggest. After you write the first draft of your paper, I strongly suggest that you walk away from it for a little bit. This is called incubating. This is not procrastination. That's a different problem altogether. Procrastination is, I didn't even start the paper. Incubation says, I have the paper written, but I'm going to walk away from it for a while. If you have ever turned in a paper and got it back and thought, oh man, I didn't even see those mistakes, that's because you didn't walk away from your paper long enough. And so the incubation process allows your brain to dump all that information so that when you come back to improve the paper, you don't have all of that information still in your mind. So there's a suggestion for you. Once you write that first draft, walk away from it for a little bit. Right, then we're ready to fix it up. So the first step is revising. And the idea with revising is to just look at the paper as a whole. So overall, how's the structure? Overall, how does it appear? Overall, how's my paragraph development? Do I need to move paragraphs around? Maybe one paragraph is better than the other. Remember, you always want to finish with your strongest paragraph. So maybe I need to switch some paragraphs around so that my best paragraph is at the end. Check your tone and check your voice. If I started out sounding somber and I finished sounding joyful, does that work for this paper, or did I just let something slide? You want to make sure that your paper sounds consistent. Okay, so this is looking at the paper as a whole. That step's pretty simple. So then you're looking at sentence level issues. Is my tone consistent? Do I digress? This is a huge problem in student writing. Make sure you're staying focused. Okay, so are your paragraphs focused? That is, do your specific details match your topic sentence? Remember, we talked about every body paragraph should have a topic sentence. So do all your specific details fall under that topic sentence? Also, things like, do you have a variety of sentences and sentence lengths? That's definitely a big issue. So make sure that you have changed up the length of your sentences as well as how they start. And then finally, word level problems. Please avoid jargon or cliches. Jargon is those technical terms that somebody outside of your culture or your small world that you're discussing may not understand. For example, I had a student, like I said, writing about nuclear energy. Of course, there's all kinds of jargon that comes in that world, and he had to avoid using those things because the rest of his readers didn't know what those meant. Make sure your figures of speech flow, that is your similes and metaphors, things like that. Make sure that they flow and they make sense within the context of your paper. Use strong verbs. Please don't tell me she walked into the room. Hopefully she did something more than just walk. Maybe she glided into the room. Maybe she stomped into the room. Using great verbs is a place that most students lose the opportunity to be very specific. So watch your verbs and always choose better verbs when you can. Also, there are some words you should avoid. The word there, the word it, especially. I will push you this semester to get rid of that word. So watch for the word it and let's start getting it out of our papers. The word that, many times you don't need. You can cross it out. Sometimes you do have to have it, but a lot of times you don't. Due to the fact, you could use the word because instead. Don't ever tell me I think. We understand you think. Writing is thinking on paper. So we pray that there is some thinking going on here. So you don't have to tell us that you think. Or the word you. Be very careful with the word you because the you is your reader. So unless you're speaking directly to your reader, you want to avoid the use of the word you. Okay, then we're ready to edit and proofread. Once we've done all of that revising, which honestly is the heftiest part of improving our paper, then we're ready to edit and proofread. So that is, we check for spelling and punctuation, things like that. This is where we need to go back and look at commas, things like that. I will tell you, a lot of students tend to edit and proofread before they revise, but that doesn't really make sense. Because if I'm going to delete a sentence or move a paragraph or things like that, I don't need to be worried about the commas yet. So you need to revise and then edit. Okay? Finally, you could change up the order of words if you see repeat words, things like that. This is the time to change those things. And then finally, may I suggest that you read your paper backwards. That is, you start with the very last word, then the second to last word, then the third to last word. So you're actually reading right to left instead of left to right. And you start at the very end of your paper and work to the very beginning. This does a couple of things. Honestly, what happens a lot of times when students edit is they already have in their mind what they want their paper to say, and sometimes that's not what their paper actually says. So by reading your paper backwards, what this does is that breaks that logic chain that's happening in your brain because it doesn't make sense anymore, which forces you to read each word individually. This allows you to check for spelling, for vocabulary choices, things like that you may not catch otherwise. So I think this is a great tool for editing. Okay? And please keep in mind that you may have to draft again. Just because I've edited, I may find that, oh man, this paragraph didn't work, or I need to revise my tone, something like that. So you may have to draft again. You may have multiple drafts. The longer the paper, the more drafts you probably should have. So Notice that second point says this process may repeat itself many times. Okay, so you may draft, revise, edit, proofread, then draft again, then edit, revise one more time. So know that you need to leave yourself time to do those things. Be sure to have more than one person look at your draft, because different people do have different strengths. Maybe you give it to one person, they're a sprinter, and they tell you your paper's great. You want to be sure that you have different people look at your paper. Always be sure to downshift. Anytime you can be more specific, that's something you want to do. Don't waste your words. So don't give more words than you need to, though. And of course, this is just a little English rule that a lot of students have never heard of, so I want to make sure I talk about it for just a second. Watch for passive voice. So that is, the ball was kicked by me. The problem with this sentence is that once I do this, or once I write a sentence like this, you can see that there's not really a subject, because the ball is not doing the kicking. Okay, sorry, give me just a second here. I'm going to go back. It's not letting me do this. Here we go. Sorry, I'm still working all of this out. Okay, so you can see here that the ball is not doing the kicking. That wouldn't make any sense. I'm actually the one doing the kicking. The problem is this comes at the end of the sentence, and it's in a prepositional phrase. So that doesn't work. It's not a subject. So technically, this right here is a fragment. Okay, so please don't do that. The way this sentence should read is, I kicked the ball. Make sure your subjects always come at the beginning. Just one last thing to think about as you get started writing. All right, well, that's all for the writing process. Again, you can go back and look at the textbook that covers each of these steps in more detail. I hope you all have a great day.